not actually that common to find a philosophy yoga training. I think it's the subject that a lot of people are curious to study more about, but don't always find the opportunity to really engage with it. It's something that comes along sort of as part of a bundled process of getting your 200-hour training. And that usually creates more questions than it answers. So I think the distinctive thing about what we're offering here is a chance to get things clear and at the same time to go quite deep. So it can be seen in two different ways. It's very accessible and therefore open to anybody, even if they haven't really dived deep into teacher training. But at the same time, if people have already got a good foundation in some of the main ideas of yoga philosophy, it's a chance to get clearer about how we engage with philosophy. Because it's not the same thing as knowing what's in all the old texts. The real process of yoga philosophy is thinking about how it relates to our practice, but even more importantly, I think, to our lives. And seeing how to put philosophy into practice is something that is definitely not widely offered. And we're really giving teachers a chance to ask themselves difficult questions, but also to be supported in exploring those things together, to have a forum to come together and talk. So there is some pre-recorded content, but the main part of the training is coming together for 4 live streams to talk it all through, do some preparation, come along and try and clarify what yoga means for each of us and how we engage with some of the older ideas in moving forwards as teachers in the 21st century. Well, I think in some ways, that is part of practice to really engage with where it's come from. And it's very easy sometimes to assume that yoga is timeless, that everything is sort of seamlessly evolved from thousands of years ago into what we do now. And at the same time, no evolution has taken place at all because it all goes back to the Vedas or wherever one might like to locate it. And some aspects of yoga tradition do have a very long history, and others, particularly the most familiar ones, coming together in groups to make shapes on mats, less so. And it's good to understand that, because then it really helps to clarify what yoga was before that time, and also how some of that can be preserved in what we do. And in fact, if we're practicing systems of modern yoga that evolved relatively recently, they were developed with clear intention to try and preserve connections to older ideas while at the same time innovating. And we'll be innovating in what we do just by virtue of trying to keep yoga relevant to us and to those in front of us when we're teaching. So just having a clearer sense of how others have engaged with that process over time might make it easier for us to think, what is yoga in what I do, and how do I adapt in a tradition consistent sort of a way. The only difference between us and a lot of ancient yoga teachers is that we're probably more conscious and more willing to admit that's what we're doing. In Indian tradition, it's not really done to make things up and say, look at all the new things I've invented for myself. Instead, most teachers have tried to present what they've innovated as a timeless expression of everything that their teacher and their teacher's teacher and their teacher's teacher's teacher had previously been doing, even though that's clearly now, when we look back, not the way things were. So I think that just helps us to feel empowered, to feel clearer about that process. And in this time where people are increasingly concerned about issues such as cultural appropriation, I think it's really helpful to look backwards to understand how we can move forwards responsibly. I think the most difficult thing as a teacher is thinking about how to teach philosophy. And it's a question that a lot of teachers have. How do I try to bring some of this wisdom into a short, regular drop-in class format? And I would say teaching philosophy is in some ways its own thing, but becoming clearer about some of the aspects of philosophy that inspire us makes it easier, I think, to start to explore them in all of their complexity, but really distill them down to their essence, so that a few words here and there can be very clearly aligned with a well-established perspective on what yoga means. And then over the course of time, students will really get grounded in understanding that. When it's a bit more picking a quote from here and there, it's a little less easy, I think, to, as a student, feel like you're getting a consistent message. It's otherwise this confusing web of, all the ideas about yoga. And so, I think part of what we're going to try and do is to be clear about, at least one or two things that are very clearly speaking to us, and then be better equipped to speak those ourselves in our own words. That's a good question. Yeah, as part of the training, be encouraging people to read The Truth of Yoga, and the pre-recorded part of the training builds on that book. The book itself is subtitled "A Comprehensive Guide to Yoga's History, Texts, Philosophy, and Practices." So it's really an overview of the traditions that have brought us to where we are now, and the first thing that I discovered when I was researching not just the book, really, these subjects myself as a practitioner, a curious, I guess, investigator. I used to be a journalist, so I like digging deep, and truth is therefore something that's always been important to me. I found that a lot of the stories I was being told by my teachers were a little bit misleading, not least that some of the practices we were doing were very ancient when they actually weren't. And at first that it was a little bit disillusioning, but I came to see it actually quite differently, that it's possible to be clear about facts without having to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, yoga's all just some recent invention, or it's all glorified calisthenics, or whatever, I guess, pejorative, disparaging label people sometimes stick on it when they're being critical. And in the academic world, there is a quite critical perspective on studying yoga. That's the essence of advanced study, really. And I've had exposure to that and found it very helpful in the end. What I've tried to do in my book is to distill some of the ideas from the scholarly world into plain English in accessible ways. And our training will be doing something similar to really dive deep into the meaning of things. But to keep it accessible, to keep it light, to keep it on a level where it might also be possible to do something with this information rather than feel overwhelmed by it. And I suppose the most important thing, which is I guess perhaps potentially slightly misleading in my own choice of title, is that there isn't one single truth in the yoga tradition. The first truth of yoga is that there are many different truths, and again, I think that's a good thing for us as teachers and practitioners, because we have to each find our own truth. And that doesn't necessarily mean this relative world of, my truth can be completely detached from the objective world. It's more, we find our own way of relating to the timelessness of the way of being that is yoga. And there are different systems of philosophy that explain that. There are different forms of practice for accessing it. And we all have our particular preferences. So thankfully, we're not obliged to pick one text from the ancient history of yoga and pretend we embody it perfectly in the 21st century. We can, to a certain extent, cherry pick. But that means we need to be a bit clearer about what's true in this worldview and what's true in that worldview, and not just jumble it all up together and make a word salad out of the whole thing. Well, I suppose having written a book called "The Truth of Yoga," I've got some idea that there's quite a bit of perhaps less than truthful information out there in the yoga world, and one can find misrepresentation wherever one looks in life. So not really trying to point the finger at anybody, or definitely not trying to be the yoga police. But I do think that there's still, even now, despite a lot of the recent research has become better known, some misconceptions about what's new and what's old in the world of yoga. So that's the first thing, just understanding a bit better the historical evolution of what we do. Put very simply, it's that for most of the history of yoga, the practice was to meditate. And now we've got many more ways into a meditative state, and they're a bit different. So the challenge is to try and keep some of that meditative orientation alive, rather than just turning it into feeling good in our bodies. So I think there's this first foundational thing: yoga and meditation aren't different things. They were the same thing until very recently. And the second thing, I guess, relates to what we've been discussing in terms of broader philosophy, the idea that there are different systems, there are different approaches to truth, there are different practices. And in the modern world, everybody just mixes things together as if it's all the same thing. So to sum up most clearly what I would call a popular misconception, everyone says yoga means union. It comes from Patanjali, and it's all about subtle body and chakras. And those are three completely separate things that come from different aspects of yoga tradition. Of course, they can be combined in one's own practice, but they speak about different orientations to practice, I think. And it's helpful to see how they differ before we stick them all together in one package. So that's the kind of thing we'll be clarifying on the course. And again, not to really say anybody's got something wrong, it's more just to be clearer about why we're prioritizing certain information over other approaches. And in the end, the simplest thing to say about Patanjali and union is that he says union is the problem. And there's a different approach to yoga in his Yoga Sutras to becoming clear. And that's to turn away from all the things that are misleading and causing suffering, and instead to rest in the timeless state that is free of all of that. And it's just a different perspective, but definitely is not about bringing everything together into oneness. And we don't need to make all of the yoga things fit together into oneness to be able to appreciate them and to align ourselves, I guess, authentically with yoga tradition, because in the end, authenticity is a personal question, really. We need to have our own inquiry into these things. But that gets easier when we know sort of which path we're most drawn towards, rather than trying to go in three different directions at once.
Great, that's been incredibly helpful and interesting. Thank you so much, Daniel.
Welcome. Really looking forward to getting started. So if any of this has piqued your curiosity, please do join us. It'll be a pleasure to get together and chat.
Yeah, so the course will run in January and there'll be more information below. Thank you so much.
Thank you.